It's been a dramatic week in terms of diplomacy surrounding the situation in Gaza. In a meeting with the King of Jordan, we heard Trump continue to push for his long-term vision of an ethnically cleansed Gaza Strip. And in the more sort of immediate time, we witnessed the possible breakdown of the Gaza ceasefire deal. It was agreed just 3 weeks ago, but on Monday this week, it seemed under threat when Hamas complained that the Israelis were not sticking to their side of the bargain and said they would postpone releasing hostages until Israel complied. And then on Tuesday, Netanyahu raised the stakes by suggesting he would begin bombing Gaza on Saturday if hostages were not released, or of course restart bombing on Gaza. But after negotiations in Cairo on Wednesday, and by Thursday it was announced the deal was back on track and that there will in fact be an exchange of captives this weekend. The ceasefire has held. So what should we make of this sequence of events? Did Hamas's gambit force Israel to begin complying with the deal in a way they hadn't been before? Or was it Hamas that ultimately folded under the threat of Netanyahu's sort of saying that he would begin bombing again? And more importantly, of course, what does this all mean for the people of Gaza? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Muhammad Shehada. He's a Gazan analyst, writer, and visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I began by asking for his reflections on the week.
Well, it's a strong sense of déjà vu. The average Gazan has lived through at least 15 Israeli military assaults in Gaza, military operations or killing sprees, about 4 or 5 wars and 2 major ground invasions. And after each one of those wars ended, it ended with an agreement between Israel and Hamas to lift or substantially ease the blockade. As soon as the agreement is signed, Israel's position is that once the ceasefire is there, nobody's going to care for the details. You can do whatever you want. I think that position was articulated by Ehud Barak, Israel's defense minister, in 2008, Operation Cast Lead. And it's happening now again. So Israel signs an agreement finally with Netanyahu's own signature, because that's something Hamas insisted on, that it should not be anybody except Netanyahu, to make sure it'll go through and will be sort of binding. And as soon as it's signed, Netanyahu literally bans his government and ministers and spokespeople from using the word deal or agreement or ceasefire. He only refers to it as the outline. And he makes explicit, as soon as he signs this, that this is non-binding. You can do whatever you want. So in Philadelphia, for example, there was supposed to be a clause on gradual Israeli withdrawal from that corridor between Rafah and Egypt. None of that happened. There was supposed to be immediate entry of 200,000 tents, 60,000 caravans. If you remember Biden's speech from May 31st last year, he said that as soon as the ceasefire is signed, quote, there will be hundreds of thousands of housing units going in immediately. None of them, zero, none of them were allowed. So that's basically the picture. Israel violates the agreement in every sense of the word, and then goes on a killing spree in the ceasefire itself. They killed close to 100 Gazan civilians in Rafah, in Jabalia, in Shijaya, all throughout the Gaza Strip. So it's a repetition of what Israel has been doing for years. It's just maddening to see the entire world just looking the other way and pretending something else other than reality.
And in terms of, I suppose, specifically what we've seen this week, so Hamas said that they would not be releasing further hostages until Israel did more to keep to the ceasefire agreement. They've now said that they will be releasing hostages on Saturday. Does that mean that Israel have compromised to some degree? Have there been sort of real commitments or actions which suggest that Israel is more willing to keep to the letter of the ceasefire agreement than it was, say, at the start of the week?
There were some signs of a compromise. So, for example, on the night before Hamas announced resuming the ceasefire, Israel allowed into Gaza 800 trucks. That is 200 trucks more than the daily average that is stipulated in the ceasefire agreement. And that is to retroactively make for shortages, because up until Hamas's announcement, Israel had only allowed into Gaza 70% of the amount of trucks that were supposed to go in, and 30% of the amount of fuel that was supposed to go into Gaza. So that was taken as a sign of improvement. There were assurances given by the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, that caravans will start going into Gaza, as well as tents and other temporary housing arrangements. And we saw a video, I think, of about 7 caravans that went in for the Red Crescent that was to be used for a field hospital. But the day after, when the ceasefire was resumed and Hamas made the announcement, Netanyahu violated again immediately on the spot. You saw a footage of literally dozens and dozens, an endless queue of trucks, bulldozers, and trucks carrying caravans waiting at the Rafah border crossing. And Netanyahu explicitly saying, none of them will be allowed into Gaza through Rafah, zero. So it's insane how this keeps going through the same repetitive cycle.
And I know you have family in Gaza. You're from Gaza. Could you talk about the situation there at the moment? I mean, obviously, a couple of weeks ago, we were reporting on people sort of going back to their homes, often from the south to the north. We know that a vast proportion of homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. What is the latest on people, I suppose, trying to rebuild their lives? And I suppose, did a threat of bombing resuming on the weekend disrupt that to some degree?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, first of all, the immense fear that this is going to be resumed again. At the same time, the quiet allows people more mental range and capacity to process everything that they've been through. What does it actually mean to have lost your entire family and your home? So the pain and anguish began with the ceasefire to be incredibly and significantly amplified, and not the other way around. There's the other dimension, as you said, a lot of family members and friends went back to their neighborhoods. They didn't only, it's not only that they didn't find their homes, they didn't find the entire neighborhood. They cannot locate where their homes used to be. The entire area is gone. I even have a friend who's been to Gaza recently, came out about a week ago, and he said that he went through an international organization. He said basically that there is a thick stench that is enveloping the entirety of Gaza, and that stench is everywhere. And it's a stench of decomposing dead bodies as well as gunpowder. You can smell the gunpowder in the air everywhere because of the insane level of bombardment that was inflicted on Gaza. He said it looked 100% like the Darfur genocide of 2003. That there are thousands of bodies out there. You can smell the body. You can't get it out. There's no way to get it out under the rubble. And at the other side, like there were some improvements in terms of food, access to food. So that was slightly, but not sufficiently improved. At the same time, no place to be, basically. So I keep getting phone calls and messages from friends and families trying to beg for help if I know somebody whose home was not destroyed that they can go and stay with. Basically, people say that I miss having a wall that I can lean back against. There are no walls left. You're just like in a tent permanently. That friend that went to Gaza, he toured around both north and south. He said Rafah is no more. Jabalia is no more. Gaza City, heavily bombarded. Some of it is still there, but the majority is either completely destroyed or heavily damaged to the point that it's uninhabitable.
And when this ceasefire was first agreed, there was quite a lot of sort of international discussion about how this could begin to see international media entering Gaza, or more international NGOs or human rights monitors, for example, entering Gaza to try and see sort of the real damage that's been done. As far as I understand, that hasn't really happened. I haven't seen sort of many Western journalists enter Gaza and report from the ground there. What's your understanding of that? Are Israel blocking sort of international observers entering Gaza still?
Yeah, absolutely. There are still ways for people to go in. It's immensely difficult. It's mainly international organizations that have sort of the ability to obtain credentials to go into Gaza. But at the same time, journalists are not even trying. And you don't have to speculate. If you look at Jenin, an area in the West Bank that's open for them to go to, they don't bother to go there in the first place. Why would they bother with Gaza? There is like clear, deliberate, manifest intention to say, Gaza is no more, end of the line, move on, find something else. Let's shut down that topic. There's this deliberate attempt to just make people look the other way and forget that Gaza ever existed. The other thing is when the ceasefire, the temporary one in November 2023 was implemented, the one that lasted for a week, there were some international delegations that made it into Gaza. For example, the Qatari state minister at the time, Lulwa Al-Khater, she's now the education minister, she insisted on going to Gaza with Qatari charity, and she managed to go in. She toured Rafah and visited people and talked to people on the ground. You don't see people even trying to do that anymore. There's the sense that Western governments and officials just don't want to in the first place.
suppose what the Western media have been discussing at length are Donald Trump's statements about moving out the entire population of Gaza, or I suppose ethnically cleansing the population of Gaza. I want to read a quote from a tweet of yours this week that I thought was really interesting. You said, "Gazans are not cattle to be herded from one ground to another and be ethnically cleansed," which is obviously the Trump and Netanyahu plan. But you said, "But they're also not pickles to be locked up in a jar in a permanent state of non-life to preserve the Palestinian cause." And I suppose I interpreted from that sort of some ambivalence about the idea of Palestinians being able to leave Gaza. What did you mean sort of when you tweeted that?
It's basically not ambivalence, but you have to draw a clear distinction. People in Gaza should have the right to go in and out. That is mainly what the Israeli blockade was about in the first place, locking people up in a permanent state of non-life, in a toxic cage from birth to death. So they have the right to go in. They have the right to go back in again. The problem with what Trump is proposing is depopulating the entirety of Gaza without the possibility of ever going back again. So two things: complete ethnic cleansing, never go back. And then the third element that makes it genocidal, it's not only ethnic cleansing, but it's genocide, is dispersing Palestinians in Gaza to dozens of countries as to that they would cease to exist as a group. If you assimilate them into, let's say, 24 countries where they become citizens of these countries, they are no longer able to exist as a Palestinian group anymore. So it is a destruction of a group in whole or in part. The definition of a genocide, if you couple it with Israel creating conditions that would render the existence of the group impossible, a perfect genocidal scenario. There's no getting around it. But on the other side, what I was trying to say, even before this genocide, even before the war started, there was a need for many Gazans to go in as long as they can go back again, as long as they have that option. So to go out of Gaza, for example, for medical treatment, you had a lot of cancer patients, a lot of people that were wounded from previous Israeli military assaults. For example, the Gaza Great March of Return, there were 30,000 people that were wounded in it, even more. A lot of them need reconstructive surgery periodically, consistently over a decade. So that needs a sort of constant medical attention. And those people are in need of getting out to get that care as long as they can go back in again. There's also, before this genocide started, Gaza had a surplus of teachers, up to 50,000 teachers. There was a similar surplus of nurses and other professions, because the market is saturated and because Israel's blockade destroyed, decimated, collapsed the economy. The ideal scenario would be for Israel's illegal, criminal, draconian blockade to be lifted. But as long as it's not, as long as countries are unwilling, you can help some Gazans, not all of them, but you can help some to get jobs outside and use the remittances that they would send back to their families to build an economy, similar to Lebanon. The majority of Lebanon's population lives outside of Lebanon. I think it's about 15 million that live outside of it. And the remittances are the thing that is uplifting the economy as a temporary mechanism until Israel's sort of sabotage of Lebanon's economy, Israel's sort of draconian provocations, as well as the international community's sort of implicit sanctions are lifted, and Lebanon is able to function again. So you also had in Gaza about 150,000. Right now you have 150,000 students, graduates of high school, as well as university students. Israel destroyed every single university in Gaza, and I think about 70% of schools, nothing is left. So for those students in particular, those young kids, even before October 7th, they were being offered scholarships in the hundreds and thousands annually, for example, to Turkey, to Qatar, to Egypt, to Venezuela, to the Northern Africa Horn, so Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, as well as many other countries. Even in Europe, there were even scholarships, I think a couple to Hungary, Czech Republic, Switzerland, Poland, etc. So why not increase those? Because the scholarship, it came already with a written declaration that each student had to sign on that says, I vow that I will only go study for this certain number of years, and then I will go back to Gaza. And if I don't, I will pay this huge penalty. So you guaranteed that people went out and then returned again with a rich educational experience that they can contribute to. So that can be something similar. If you look, for example, at Trump's eyes, they immediately lit ablaze as soon as Jordan's king said, I will take in 2,000 Gazan children that have cancer or terminal illnesses or wounds from the war. He was in love with it immediately. So if you try to propose similar ideas that would genuinely help Gaza without ethnically cleansing it and with a clear framework that those people that leave will be able to return again, you might be able to sort of distract from Trump's catastrophic, insane idea of just sort of destroying the place to the ground and starting from scratch.
Yeah. So I suppose in terms of sort of a practical suggestion from what you're saying in that tweet and what you're saying now is that there should be more sort of countries and governments who are willing to offer the chance for a specific number of Palestinians in Gaza to come for a temporary time to study or to get medical treatment, so that these people aren't all just completely trapped there. And can I also sort of take from your tweet that you think that there's been some reluctance to do that because people are so rightly concerned that there is this desire on the part of the Israelis and the Americans to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, that they think it's too complicated to talk about providing sanctuary for anyone in Gaza because that would be playing into Israel and America's hands.
Yep. It's not only concern, they know it for sure. So Israel's idea of emptying out Gaza, it wasn't born with this genocide. It's been out there since the Nakba. As soon as Israel kicked the majority of Palestinians from the majority of historic Palestine into the West Bank and Gaza and beyond, they tried to kick people further out from Gaza itself into Egypt and Jordan. So if you look back at the record, in 1948, I think about 200,000 Palestinians went to Gaza, tripling the population there, or more than tripling the population. And the population ever since has been 2/3 refugees. So basically, as soon as that happens, a lot of those Palestinians try to go back into their homes when the war was done, when the war was over. They tried to go, for example, to pick fruit from their farms because their villages were only a couple of kilometers away from Gaza. The villages that now Israeli kibbutzim stand on that were attacked on October 7th. And some were trying to go out to reunite with their families or to find sanctuary in the West Bank or in other areas. As soon as that happens, Israel creates a unit in the IDF that was known as the Unit 101 under Ariel Sharon, that is tasked with inflicting immediate brutal violence against what they termed as infiltrators and terrorists, or fidaiyin at the time, mukharribin, they called it, like sabotage. So basically, that unit, it begins to inflict one massacre after the other. It was called the reprisal attacks. So for example, in 1953, they did a massacre in the Burej refugee camp. They've focused on refugee camps in particular in Gaza to terrorize people there so that they would flee to Egypt. As in addition to those massacres, Israel signed what is called the Armistice Agreement with Egypt that took away further 200 square kilometers from Gaza's area. So the Gaza Strip after 48, it was about 536 kilometers, if I remember correctly, or 565 kilometers. So Israel took away 200 kilometers in that armistice deal that was signed with Egypt to prevent the infiltrations, as they called it, so that it would be a buffer zone. Gaza became what it is today, about 360 square kilometers in area. Even then, Israel was pressuring Egypt, along with the United States, to relocate actively refugees in Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. So in 53, they managed to get an agreement between Egypt and UNRWA, ironically, Israel's main target now. And the United States offered to pay $30 million, the equivalent today of $355 million, to relocate 12,000 refugees into Egypt. The plan was agreed upon by Egypt and UNRWA, the United States, Israel's tacit approval. And Israel started launching these massacres simultaneously to scare people so they would agree to it. Gazans refused. They demonstrated, took to the street. The Egyptian governor in Gaza, the military governor, he had to flee to Sinai, and from Al Arish, a city in Sinai, he declared the death of that plan in 1955. The year after, as soon as that plan dies, Israel invades Gaza, occupies it for 4 months, destroys vital infrastructure, commits another number of massacres, the Khan Yunis massacre, where they killed, I think, a few hundred people, including people whose children later on became top Hamas and Islamic Jihad leader. So Abdulaziz al-Rantisi, he's a survivor of the Khan Yunis massacre. He saw his own uncle getting butchered, lined up against the wall and shot. Ziad al-Nakhala, the head of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, he saw his own father getting shot when he was 3. And he said the voice of his mother screaming in terror never left his head since he was 3. So after that massacre, Israel continues to expel Palestinians in Gaza. The occupation, Israel was forced to end it 4 months later by the United States. They keep the reprisal attacks on Gaza to push people out. When they occupied it in 1967, they tried again, over and over again. It sent, I think, about 38,000 Gazans to flee to Egypt or forcibly evicted to Egypt during the war and its immediate aftermath. Israel tries a sort of multifaceted strategy of a carrot and a stick. The carrot, at some point, they set up in Gaza what they called as immigration centers. You go there, you sign up, you get a passport, a handsome amount of money, and a ticket to Canada or to Latin America or to Europe or to the United States. Only 200 families left that way, 200. So it was a failure. Israel paid for it from their own pockets. They paid $500,000 to get them out. It didn't work. They tried another thing to destroy the refugee camps. They destroyed, I think, if my memory is correct, it was in the tens of thousands of homes to open up roads for military activities. That was the pretext, but the actual concern was destroying the camps to begin with. They offered people in the camps land zones that they can build new buildings on, cities and towns, so that they move out of the refugee camps. And they continued to exile people from Gaza into Egypt. Ariel Sharon, who committed the Brage massacre, became the commander of the Southern Command in the IDF in charge of Gaza and the Negev area. And Gazans called him the bulldozer and the butcher for 2 reasons: committing massacres nonstop, like in the Khan Yunis massacre or the Brage massacre, as well as destroying homes to drive people out. It didn't work either. It pushed a substantial portion of Gaza's population to leave, but the population didn't die. They recovered 10 years later, returned to what the levels were before the 6-day war. Israel tried it again in the 80s, in the 90s. In 2004, you had Giora Island, the chief of Israel's National Security Council. He basically says in a WikiLeaks leaked cable, he says Gaza is, quote, a huge concentration camp, and we need to annex 600 square kilometers from the Sinai Peninsula that Gazans can go to. That is the only way. In 2019, the idea is still on Israel's agenda. That is basically the core essence of the blockade, is what Moshe Dayan, when he was Israel's defense minister, he talked about in 1967. He said, we will tell Palestinians we have no solution. You will continue to live like dogs. Whoever wants to leave would leave. Otherwise, you stay here and perish. And then he goes on to predict that strategy, live like a dog or leave, would push 200,000 people to leave. And it did. Israel's blockade on Gaza, by October 7th, it had pushed about 200,000 Gazans to leave over those 17 years. In 2019, Netanyahu, on a visit to Ukraine, he leaks to Israeli media as a senior official, didn't use his name, but everybody knew it was him. He says that Israel is actively looking and pursuing and talking to host countries that would take in migrants from Gaza. He said Israel is willing to pay for the transport, for the shuttles, for the airplanes, but he couldn't find the destination. So that idea is consistently on Israel's mind.